It jammed, cold and stubborn, in the sergeant's hands as the target retreated into cover. He cursed under his breath, yanking at the bolt. Every muscle in his body nodded with panic. The range had gone dead silent around him. Too many watching, too many waiting, every heartbeat pounding against his skull. And then, her hand appeared. Scarred. Unshaken. She reached for the weapon without a word, her eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a faded cap. No ceremony, no announcement. Just a steady presence that unsettled the men who'd been laughing at her only moments before. When the sergeant surrendered the weapon, her sleeve slipped back, revealing the faint glint of metal pressed close to her wrist. A medal. Not pristine, but weathered, etched by years of wear. And carved into its back, crudely, like someone had done it with the point of a knife, were numbers. Not dates. Not initials. Numbers. 7. The room changed in that instant. They had called her dead weight the moment she walked through the gates. Too old, they said. Too broken. What use was a woman who barely spoke, who carried her duffel like it was full of ghosts? The recruits, boys mostly, watched her with the arrogance of those who had never bled in a place without order. She looked like no one special, hair tied back with no care for style, boots that had seen deserts, mountains, jungles. Her jacket hung loose as though she'd shrunk inside of it. But her silence was heavy. The kind of silence that made a room colder. The sergeant had noticed it first when she entered the armory. She didn't gawk at the weapons. Didn't reach for the new rifles with the same greedy hands as the others. She simply looked, one by one, as if counting something he could not see. And when his own M107 jammed, deliberately handed to her as a joke, the recruits whispering that she wouldn't know the difference, she took it with hands that bore scars like maps of another life. Once, long ago, she had been more than a shadow. Her name had been whispered over radios, not in fear, but in reverence. A sniper in conflicts where the line between survival and annihilation was drawn by a single pull of a trigger. Her world had smelled of hot metal and gun oil, of dust that clung to lungs until coughing brought blood. Nights where she lay belly down in mud, tasting iron on her tongue, her cheek pressed against the stock of a rifle that became more familiar than her own reflection. She remembered the first one. The shot that changed everything. The recoil had slammed into her shoulder, and for an instant, she had thought the earth itself had shifted beneath her. Then silence. The kind of silence that swallowed the screams of the living. 427 times she pulled that trigger. 427 lives ended because her comrades needed her to. Each number she carved into the metal was not for glory, but for penance. She had etched them with the edge of her combat knife, her hands trembling, her stomach hollowing with each scrape of steel against brass. She carried the metal, not because she was proud, but because it reminded her never to forget. Never to pretend. "Hey, Sergeant, careful she doesn't drop it," one recruit muttered when she reached for the M107. The laughter rose around them, a hollow, disrespectful noise that tightened the sergeant's jaw. He was no saint himself, but something in the way they mocked her felt wrong. As though they were jeering at a tombstone. She didn't flinch. Didn't defend herself. She only ran her fingers across the weapon, her eyes narrowing at the jam as though she were staring through the layers of steel itself. The recruits fell quieter when she worked. Not out of respect, but disbelief. She didn't slam the weapon. Didn't curse. She listened. Tilted her head. Slid the bolt back with a gentleness that seemed almost alien to the heavy beast of a gun. When the cartridge finally ejected, clinking against the floor, the sergeant's breath caught. Her hands hadn't shaken once. But the disrespect did not stop. "She's just a relic," someone whispered later. "They only brought her here because they ran out of real soldiers. Bet she's never even seen combat." Their voices dripped like venom into the corners of the hall. No one spoke in her defense. Not yet. The sergeant watched, his chest burning with a conflict he couldn't name. She said nothing. She always said nothing, but he noticed her hands. The way she pressed her palm against that metal as though steadying herself. There was a weight in that touch. And then, one evening, when she placed her bag on the bench, the metal slipped free, clinking softly as it spun across the wood. The recruits leaned in, ready to mock. But when they saw the numbers carved into the back, their grins faltered. 427? What's that supposed to mean? A joke? Her silence was the only answer. Silence, and the way she picked it up, dusted it gently, and tucked it back inside her jacket. But the sergeant saw her eyes. For the first time, he saw the storm behind them. The following day, the commanding officer announced a live-fire exercise. High pressure. Targets at impossible range. Most of the recruits shifted nervously, their bravado evaporating under the weight of real stakes. The sergeant's M107 was handed to her again, deliberately, cruelly, as though daring her to humiliate herself in front of everyone. She did not argue, did not resist. She only knelt, pressed her cheek to the stock and breathed. The world seemed to narrow until it was only her, the rifle, and the horizon. The first shot shattered the quiet. The target collapsed, distant and invisible to every eye but hers. The second followed. Then the third. Then a rhythm, each shot falling like a heartbeat, unshaken, unbroken, devastating in its precision. When she finally lowered the weapon, the field had gone silent. The recruits who had mocked her stood frozen, their mouths dry, their laughter dead. And it was then the sergeant spoke. His voice low, almost reverent. "You've been carrying it all this time." She looked at him, her eyes unreadable, but her silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. True warriors don't count victories. They count the cost. Respect isn't demanded. It's earned, often in silence, often unseen. She never raised her voice, because her record spoke louder than any shout could. The next morning she walked through the gates again. But the whispers were gone. Instead, every recruit rose to their feet, standing in silence as she passed. Not ordered, not commanded, an instinct, as though something deep inside them knew they were in the presence of someone they could never match. The sergeant stood among them, his jaw tight with something that felt like pride. He had been the one to mock once, the one to doubt. But now he understood. She carried her 427 not as a badge of glory, but as chains she refused to let slip. Chains that kept her human, even after everything she had seen, everything she had done. And the silence that followed her was no longer scorn. It was respect. The only kind that mattered. Heroes are not always loud. They do not always stand in the spotlight, demanding recognition. Sometimes, they are the ones who sit quietly in the corner, carrying more weight than we can ever imagine. She never asked for thanks. Never boasted. But her silence was her legacy, her medal the proof. And the sergeant, once her skeptic, once her mocker, would never forget the day he handed her that jammed rifle, and found himself holding a story etched with 427 ghosts. If you believe respect must be earned not by words, but by sacrifice, if you believe true strength can live in silence, then share this story. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And subscribe, so together, we can honor the heroes whose voices may be quiet, yet whose legacies thunder louder than any applause.